You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled The Psychology of Pornography, presented by Dr. Chiara Simeone-DiFrancesco. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the Interim Director at the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. This is ITEST's first interactive webinar, which means that we'll follow the presentation with breakout rooms, with a polling system that'll actually take place during the presentation, and with a Q&A that follows. So we're ready to begin. Before I introduce Dr. Chiara Simeone-DiFrancesco, I'd like to introduce her husband, Romuald Simeon, who is a Catholic missionary and evangelist who will open us in prayer. Rami?
Lord Jesus, we follow the prayer of the love letters of John, the books of Corinthians, Ephesians, and Peter. Lord, you give every human being the gift of belonging to the human race. We are assured this includes the mind to think, the will to share, the power to act equally. Thank you, Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rami. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Chiara Simeone-DiFrancesco. Chiara holds a PhD from the University of Mississippi in multiple master's degrees from Columbia University. She graduated with a double BA in Religious Studies and Philosophy from Holy Apostles College and Seminary. As a licensed psychologist for 31 years, she has always integrated her Catholic perspective of the human being into her work in the values that underpin it. She is the owner, director of the Jesus-Centered Chemotherapy Institute, a division of Connect Talk, LLC. She also co-manages the Jesus Center Institute, which is active in producing biblical books and media. She has been published by Wiley-Blackwell, a book entitled Chemotherapy with Couples, a Practitioner's Guide to Healing Relationships. Her current passion is to help Catholic and Christian therapists understand and learn how to invite Jesus into sessions they have with Christian clients, both in directing and inspiring the intervention of the therapist, and in directly speaking to the heart of the client through the evidence-based use of chemotherapy. As an internationally certified trainer in chemotherapy, Chiara has been instrumental in the development of this therapy, both with couples and its application with multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious dialogue. She is enthusiastic about the ethics and efficacy of bringing the gospel of Jesus into all aspects of client, patient, and pastoral care for clients coming from a Christian, Catholic religion and culture who wish to incorporate this richness into their treatment plan. With that, Dr. Simeone-DiFrancesco, take it away.
Thank you, Sebastian. Wow, that's quite an introduction. The only thing that matters to me in that, as I told you before, is that I'm Jesus-centered. And that's what I'm going to be stressing in my talk today, that I believe that Jesus is the answer. And when we center our life and our work on him with a true connection with him, that's when we get liberated and we get healed from the various emotional maladies that we have. So pornography being unfortunately one of those, and I'm going to start sharing my screen and want to explain that when I do this webinar here, it's going to be really in a pretty easygoing fashion. I want you to know I have far more slides to share with you than I can go through. This will be like a booklet for you that I'm publishing, and you're going to have your own copy of that. So what I skim through fast, don't worry about it. Don't worry about taking notes. You're going to get it in your hands. And you can also listen to the recording. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so I would like to explain that there are no conflicts of interest connected to this presentation. It is presented to assist a Christian audience from a Christian perspective. It intersects the gospel with what we know about science. I also want to express specific gratitude to the contributions of Dr. Joshua Grubbs, who was very helpful to me in sharing some of his slides. You will see some of those noted with his name on them, the slides that he has shared. Also, I want to express gratitude to the beautiful position paper put out by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I encourage you to go to their website, look at their position papers. They have one that's called Pornography and Interactive Sexual Devices. I've quoted that extensively and used some of their materials, and I am very appreciative of the fine work that they've done. Also, I'd like you to be aware that this webinar is not the provision of psychological services, nor is it meant to treat any mental health condition or provide advice in any particular case. It does not involve the establishment of a client-psychologist relationship. Our learning objectives are listed here. I won't necessarily be going through these in this order, but we will be looking at some of these issues. If we want to understand the prevalence of pornography here. First, we're going to just look at the plain data. Now, take in mind that this data is not updated in 2021, but up to 7% of women and 11% of men in the US report concerns about compulsive sexual behaviors. In 2016, in the USA, 91% of male university students and 62% of females viewed porn during their adolescence, with 49% of males viewing before age 13. And that very much fits with what I have found clinically. 64% of ages 13 to 24 pursue viewing biweekly. The world's most popular pornography sites average 92 million visits and rank number 8 among all sites in the world. It's amazing, the industry that is connected here. 1 in 4 internet users view porn in any given month. Sexually explicit dress, actions, and dialogue are common in purportedly family-friendly programs, and soft porn is increasing. And among practicing Christians, 2% seek out porn daily, 5% weekly, 6% once or twice a month, and 21% of youth pastors and 14% of senior pastors admit to using it regularly. Among the users, 56% said that they were addicted, and 33% senior pastors said they were addicted. When we look at mental health providers, 39.4% report having seen someone with addiction, and 48.8% report having seen someone with problematic pornography use. And with college counseling centers, 84% reported treating compulsive sexual behavior in the last 12 months. So I've actually laid out here quite a detailed evaluation of whether is it an addiction, a compulsion, or a type of substance use disorder. We know that pornography becomes a compulsion, but what about being an addiction? This is in the scientific community and especially the psychological community a debate. Is it a process or a behavioral addiction? These are two types. Is it also a true physiologically based addiction? Is it a compulsivity? Is compulsivity itself an addiction? And is compulsivity akin to a substance use disorder? If you purport to be a follower of the gospel, what does the gospel say about it? I'm going to give you the tip. I think that it's basically all of these, all of the above. But let's look at what we have for research behind this and understanding why. In the psychology world, the term addiction is controversial. Let's look at the secular attempt to try to define it. Central to its definition is the dependence on a substance or activity. Addiction is treatable, chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experience. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. Let's look now at what a substance use disorder is. Substance use, and the emphases here are mine, are complex conditions in which there is an uncontrolled use of a substance despite harmful consequences. It's pornography, right? People with substance use disorders have an intense focus on using a certain substance, such as alcohol, tobacco, or illicit drugs, to the point where the person's ability to function in day-to-day life becomes impaired. In other words, they keep using the substance even when they know it's causing or will cause problems. And the most severe substance use disorders are sometimes called addictions. People with a substance use disorder may have distorted thinking and behaviors. So do you see that? That fits because changes in the brain structure and function are what cause people to have intense cravings, and changes in personality, abnormal movements, and other behaviors. Brain imaging studies, and we're going to go into this a little more deeper. It's really fascinating, especially with the research of Dr. Hilton and colleagues. Brain imaging studies show changes in the areas of the brain that relate to judgment, decision-making, learning, memory, and behavioral control. This is fascinating. Repeated substance use can cause changes in how the brain functions. These changes can last long after the immediate effects of the substance wearing off. In other words, after a period of intoxication, which is the intense pleasure, euphoria, or calm, which is experienced with pornography, increased perception and sense and other feelings that are caused by the substance. These intoxication symptoms are different for each substance. Obviously, they're different for pornography because of the sexual experience. When someone has a substance use disorder, they usually build up tolerance to it, meaning they need larger amounts to feel the effects. And there is research supporting that in order to have sexual release, pornographer users need higher and higher amounts of more stimulating materials. As you think about it, many of these aspects apply to pornography as a substance abuse. Okay, process addiction or behavioral addictions. Addiction can occur in many forms. Often it's assumed that physical dependence is characterized by withdrawal symptoms. That is the requirement in order for someone to be diagnosed with an addiction disorder. But the fact is, behavioral addiction can occur with all the negative consequences in a person's life. minus the physical issues faced by people who compulsively engage in drug and alcohol abuse. Now, this is how the definition reads, but what I've added here is you will see that there are physical issues, changes in the brain with pornography use, and increasing arousal issues, erectile issues, etc. It's the compulsive nature of the behavior that's often indicative of a behavioral addiction or process addiction in an individual. And the compulsion is to continually engage in an activity or behavior despite the negative impact on the person's ability to remain mentally or physically healthy and functional in the home. And we're going to see what happens with pornography use and how that affects that ability to have a healthy presence in the home. The person may find the behavior rewarding psychologically or get a high while engaging in it, later feel guilt or remorse, and they're unable to stop engaging in the behavior for any length of time. Now we're going to look further at what the scientific community says about addictions. Until recently, non-substance related behavioral addiction was not even listed in the two internationally used diagnostic manuals of mental disorders, the DSM-5 and the ICD-10. The DSM-5 now has listed two of them. So actually, the reference there is not exactly accurate. When it wasn't listed in previous versions of the DSM, but it is listed in the DSM-5. And we will see these two non-substance related ones listed as gambling disorder and internet gaming disorder. And in the psychological community, there is an issue of what actually constitutes a disorder. This is why some of the controversy exists. There's a blurring of demarcation lines between physiology and pathology. And contrary to commonly held beliefs, behavior science experts believe that any source which is capable of stimulating an individual can become addictive. The change of behaviors such as gambling, drug abuse, computer gaming, or chatting, and internet browsing form habits into obligatory behavior that can be considered as the development of addiction. So there we have the fitting in of pornography. You can see the references also listed at the end of my presentation. Maybe what matters most is the compulsive aspect and the difficulty overcoming it. Behavioral addiction, such as pornography, is similar to drug addiction, except in the former, the individual is not addicted to a substance, but the behavior or the feeling brought on by the relevant action. However, the neuroscience is showing us that the effects on the brain are similar. Now, here's the study by Hilton and Watts that present fascinating neurological findings. As I did the research on this, I was just amazed. They state this, that a significant postulate of this commentary is that all addictions create, in addition to chemical changes in the brain, anatomical and pathological changes, which result in various manifestations of cerebral dysfunction, collectively labeled hippofrontal syndromes. In these syndromes, the underlying defect in its simple description is called the braking system of the brain. So you may want to remember that term, the braking system. This is what it underlies, it affects. The braking system is well known to clinical neuroscientists, especially neurologists and neurosurgeons, for they see the same impairment with victims of tumors, strokes, and trauma. Indeed, anatomically, loss of these frontal control systems is most apparent following trauma, exemplified by progressive atrophy of the frontal lobes that is seen in serial MRI scans over time. So although the key elements of hippofrontal syndromes Impulsivity, compulsivity, emotional lability, impaired judgment are well described. Much of the process is still unknown. One emerging aspect of these hippofrontal states is their similarity to findings in addictive patients. Fowler notes, studies of addicts show reduced cellular activity in the orbital frontal cortex, a brain area relied on to make strategic rather than impulsive decisions. Patients with traumatic injuries to this area of the brain display problems. Think of Dahmer here, okay? Aggressiveness, poor judgment of future consequences, inability to inhibit inappropriate responses. These are similar to those observed in substance abusers. Even more instructive are similar findings seen with the abuse of normal biological behavior. And here's the link, guys. Eating, for example, can lead to an addictive eating behavior and obesity. This is a normal biological behavior. A VBM study was published specifically, that's a type of MRI study, was published specifically looking at obesity. And fascinatingly, the results were very similar to the cocaine and methamphetamine studies. The obesity study demonstrated multiple areas of volume loss, particularly in the frontal lobes, associated with judgment and control. This study is significant, demonstrating visible damage and natural endogenous addiction, as opposed to an exogenous drug addiction. Further, it's easy to intuitively accept this because the effects of overeating can be seen in the obese person. So here's the link, guys. Eating, of course, is essential to individual survival, necessary for the survival of the species. Another activity necessary for survival is sex. An observation which leads us to a series of logical questions derived from this work on obesity. Would the findings seen in eating addiction be seen in excessive sexual behavior? Can sex be addictive in the neurological sense? If so, are they associated with the anatomical changes in the brain are these associated with the anatomical changes in the brain seen with other addictions? Another VBM study that specifically looked at pedophilia demonstrated almost identical findings to the cocaine, methamphetamine, and obesity studies. It concludes for the first time that a sexual compulsion can cause physical, anatomical changes in the brain, the hallmark of brain addiction. So think of this. When a porn user thinks that it doesn't hurt him or her, it's actually causing anatomical changes in the brain. A preliminary study showed frontal dysfunction specifically in patients unable to control their sexual behavior. And this study used diffusion MRI to evaluate function of nerve transmission through white matter. It demonstrated abnormality in the superior frontal region, an area associated with compulsivity. This is the braking system again. As you can see here, the research regarding sexual behavior and sexual addiction has increased over the years. My pal here, Dr. Grubbs, started his research in 2010. He's one of the major researchers. And he kind of looks at it like this, that it is connected. Sex addiction is, simply put, compulsive patterns of sexual behavior, excessive sexual behavior that interferes with one's mental, emotional, and social or vocational well-being. But what about pornography addiction? It's the most commonly endorsed form of hypersexual behavior. It's equally controversial. It's commonly self-diagnosed Dr. Grubbs has a number of studies that show that it's self-diagnosed more in people that have a religious background. And it's classified as compulsive sexual behavior in the ICD-11. That's the latest version. Here is the reading, the criteria of the ICD-11. You can read this at your leisure later. But again, it shows the impairment of the braking system and persistent failure to control intense, repetitive sexual impulses or urges, resulting in repetitive sexual behavior. And it shows how it needs to affect a person emotionally over that issue and cause distress. We can see with the research of Koob and Lamole that it affects the dopamine cycles. And we're going to look at this aspect of neuroscience here. You're going to understand here, I'm going to explain to you what the dopamine cycle is. They have a review of the brain reward and anti-reward system in non-drug addictions. And they conclude that non-drug and drug addictions can make the case that there's a strong face validity with the addiction cycle, which is the following. It's preoccupation, anticipation or craving, binge, intoxication, and the withdrawal negative effect stages for compulsive gambling, compulsive shopping, compulsive eating, and compulsive sexual behavior, and compulsive exercise, interestingly. So this is what their research showed, that the dopamine in our brains causes this cycle. Preoccupation, binging, and withdrawal negative effect. If you want to think of it. You can see among hypersexual disorders that the behaviors among treatment seekers that come for treatment mostly come regarding pornography use, 81.1%. Now let's look at the gospel view. We looked a bit about the science, the neuroscience, what psychologists say, how they classify it. What's Jesus have to say about this? So through the mouth of St. Paul, he says in 1 Corinthians, you are bought at a price. Do not be slaves to men. And the reference in the Jerusalem Bible states that spiritually slaves to their outlook and conventions. The conventions of the world is all based on money and sex. And you can see in this little game that I've put here that's available on Amazon, slaves to darkness, chaos spawn. And that's how the gospel looks at it. Pornography enslaves you to darkness. It enslaves a person to themselves, as well as to the entirely morally corrupt industry and the people in it who create computer algorithms to draw you in even further. I'm not sure if you all know what that means, but those that design computer websites and such, these pornography websites have mathematical equations on how they are designed to make a person want to search further and further and consume more and more of it. It's actually a scientific research on how that happens. Don't ask me how, but they do it. This is what the gospel tells us. As Christians, the necessity to remain sexually pure and that sexual activity is to be restricted to monogamous marriage between one man and one woman. See some references here, thanks to the CMDA position paper, very useful. We also can see in the encyclical of St. John Paul II in his Theology of the Body, the church makes it clear, the teaching that's proclaimed in Scripture, that the most intimate expressions of sexuality, including sexual intercourse, are uniquely gifts of self that husband and wife give to each other in the sacrament of matrimony. In his prophetic fashion, St. John Paul II makes it clear that sexuality between husband and wife, and this is so critical, is all about the gift of self that is required to be in tune with the recipient spouse, given with sensitivity to the receptivity of the spouse. Pope Paul VI on married love in Humana Vitae has further information on this. He shows us in his encyclical that in light of the facts of married life, the characteristic features and exigencies, of married life are clearly indicated, and it's of the highest importance to evaluate them exactly. So this love is above all fully human, a compound of sense and spirit. It is not then merely a question of natural instinct or emotional drive. It's an act of the free will. It's meant not only to survive the joys and sorrows of daily life, but also to grow so that husband and wife become in a way one heart and one soul. It's a love which is total. It's a very special form of personal friendship. And this is what we do in therapy when we're helping couples overcome it. We need to increase the friendship base of the relationship. So it's a friendship in which the husband and wife generously share everything, not thinking solely of their own convenience. And whoever really loves his partner loves not only for what he receives, but loves the partner for the partner's own sake. It's the ability to enrich the other with the gift of self. Married love is also faithful and exclusive of all others until death. And this is how the married couple understood it on the day of their vows, on the day of their marriage. And though this fidelity of husband and wife sometimes present difficulties, no one has the right to assert that it's impossible. See, so our Holy Father, Pope Paul VI, has let us understand that it is possible to overcome it. And in therapy, I can attest to that. My clients do overcome it. Actually, I've never had one that didn't. Humana Vitae on the promotion of chastity. Everything, therefore, everything, therefore, in the modern means of social communication, which arouses men's baser passions and encourages lower moral standards, such as pornography, as well as every obscenity, should be condemned publicly and unanimously by all of us who have at the heart the advance of civilization and the safeguarding of the outstanding values of the human spirit. It's quite absurd to defend this kind of depravity in the name of art or culture. Unfortunately, by the way, as you might know, there are psychologists and persons that defend a limited use of pornography. I don't think it makes sense, even from a scientific sense. And so those of us that work with persons that struggle or that are in the position of teaching others, forming young men and women as parents, as educators, as clergy, as sisters and religious. I think the Holy Father here encourages us to say it straight, that it is depravity. And we have clear scientific evidence, especially when you are looking at the MRI results and the effect on the braking system. There's no question of how it affects things. If you did a search on Amazon, you can see here, there's 887 results for pornography addiction. People are struggling with it. They're looking for help on it. They're trapped in it. Well, it's gone about as far as it can go. Now we have artificial intelligence algorithms, as I said, but we also even have virtual sex robots that imitate human speech and sexual behaviors that are designed to perform sexual acts with humans as an extreme elaboration of pornography. It's really upsetting, isn't it? All of these are dangerous. You should by now understand how this is so physiologically. Now we're going to look at more of the psychological, social, and spiritual effects. This will help you understand that there's simply no evidence to the contrary that it has any beneficial effect for people. But before we look at this psychological, social, and spiritual, let's look at some of the causes and try to understand what actually causes people to get into it. How do they get trapped in it? The first issue is that it gives instant gratification. It's an escape. And like all compulsions, it brings about an immediate reduction in anxiety. It's actually like classical conditioning. People like rats like to hit the internet porn button to get a pellet of food. Think of it. If you use porn, you're very much reduced to the animal level, like a rat, hitting a pellet to get anxiety relief, to feel good, or to get some other momentary high. And the dopamine effects of continuing this cause it to be craved more and more. Interestingly, girls are getting into porn as well. And there is a sociological condition because of this. They may, I think it's possible, I don't know about a clear study on this, but I've seen something from Instagram, and I believe that girls have more anxiety, possibly even than boys. Instagram shows it because it is affecting girls detrimentally with pictures of ideal beauty, and it already increases their major preoccupation with whether I'm attractive enough to be wanted and loved. In fact, these statistics came right out of the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, who states that comparisons on Instagram can change how young women view and describe themselves. He literally says we make body images worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. That does connect to their use of pornography, comparing themselves, trying to see if they're desirable. There are also family situational factors. Parents have scant supervision over their children. They are often working out of their home, or if they're working in the home, they're often preoccupied. Parents in our culture tend to have top-down communication, and I'll be emphasizing this more. They speak in conclusions and have learned, and it probably is beyond the context of what I can go into, but they've learned speaking in conclusions. What that means is they don't know how to open up personally. And they've learned this type of speaking down in conclusions, giving directions. In fact, when Rami does his exercising in a local park on his bicycle, he often will witness as a street evangelist to people in the park where there's a playground. He will often tell me how he always notices when there's grandparents versus parents with the children in the playground. The grandparents are more relaxed and laid back, and the parents are always talking in this one-down communication, telling them, don't do this, don't do that, you're going to get hurt. All of that's speaking in conclusions. So, unfortunately, and this is what I help my parents, they're not to blame. They just learned it from their parents. It's generational. They don't know how to open up often. Obviously, it doesn't apply to everyone. And they don't know how to connect. They know how to talk at their kids. They don't get personally self-disclosing on modeling healthy ways in which they can explicitly handle the anxieties of their own life. And chances are they don't do that very well either. So they just often will carry on. And sometimes when they see their child has problems, they'll send their child to me, but they're often dealing with the same issues. Now, let's look at the niche of Catholic culture families. There's some specific pitfalls there. It's proper that we have not situational morality, but we have something absolute that shows us the right way versus the wrong way. But there is a creation of a culture that becomes very extreme in the right way versus the wrong way in almost everything. And the importance, it's an attitude of, not making mistakes, of checking and rechecking and pleasing others and making sure you take responsibility to the exaggerated point. It's the point here of the exaggeration that although this can be good in moderation, to an exaggerated extent, it creates anxiety, unrelenting standards, and what we call in Chemotherapy and other types of therapies, such as internal family systems, an indomitable inner critic. You're going to start seeing more and more books on Amazon on the inner critic. You put this together with generations of emotionally independent parents who may hold back in self-disclosure and affection or affirmation and verbal non-performance related affirmation. See, what's non-performance related affirmation? It's affirmation that says, wow, you did a great job winning that basketball game, as opposed to, I'm so glad God created you and you're in my life. You make my life happy. See, that's person-centered affirmation versus performance-related affirmation. I encourage you to look at the Still Face Experiment video by Ed Tronick. It's very emotionally moving, and it shows the effects of secure attachment and emotional resonance from the baby and a mother all the way to a similar scenario between a husband and a wife. It's very fascinating. There are books to offset the interpersonal disconnect. And interpersonal disconnect is always part of pornography. This is a Christian book by Dr. Sue Johnson. I recommend it, Created for Connection. This is my book with my co-authors, more for the academic, Chemotherapy with Couples. Doesn't specifically speak much about pornography, if I recall. It's been a few years since I've written it, so I don't recall, but I don't think it's in there. But it certainly talks about the issue of the detached protector coping mode. And I will be referring to this emotionally, and the detached self-soother mode, and how these operate with couples. And pornography is connected to to a coping mode, a way of coping with life that's not healthy, that we've learned, soaked up from people that we've grown up with, or society, lots of different ways we can soak it up. That's called a detached self-soother coping mode. And the indomitable inner critic. It is a huge contributor to pornography use. What does the inner critic do? The inner critic tells people that they're defective and unworthy, and it often combines with other variables that create comorbid, which means co-occurring mental health conditions that are found alongside pornography very frequently. Persistent, then the research shows this, persistent depressive disorder, major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and other substance abuses. Here you have some of the research on comorbidities. As you can see here, 90% of patients that were involved in sexual problems and pornography endorsed a comorbid psychiatric diagnosis, 90%, and 60.6% presented at least one paraphilia. You may not know what a paraphilia is. A paraphilia is a sexual behavior that is socially unacceptable, like pornography, pedophilia, or sadism, or sexual violence. Okay, these are 60.6% of these pornography users in this study were presenting with at least one paraphilia. That's scary. There are limitations of the study. So, it does depend on the sample and how generalizable it is. These are self-report questionnaires. You can read this a little bit about the some potential problems with clinical validity, but nonetheless, it does give you an idea of what's going on here. So let's go through it again. How does pornography affect relationships and marriage and matrimony? Now, if you are a religious priest, it's going to affect the same issues with your parish community or with your fellow priests, your clergy support groups, people living in a religious community. These are all relationships that are meant to bring people closer to Jesus, insulate ourselves from mental health issues, and detach self-soothing. When these relationships, these prime relationships in our life, are impaired by pornography, with the shame that is behind pornography, there's a lack of true self-disclosure. And we can see this in the recent scandals that come out every day. You can check the current issue of the National Register. Someone ordained 2 years and no one even knew, that they had these terrible pedophilia issues. Pornography goes underground and makes us hide our real selves. We become detached. I've never known anyone that has had a pornography issue that doesn't detach from others. Why? They're not relating in an open way to others. They're relating to the fantasy that's involved in the pornography. They become an empty shell. Spouses get traumatized, and I can write an entire book on the effect on spouses. Children become disconnected from their children. Because of the nature of the addiction, they can't keep their focus properly to be emotionally in tune with anyone, even themselves, much less their spouses or their children. And pornography, like other types of betrayals, causes post-traumatic stress syndrome wounds, betrayal wounds with the betrayed family, well, at least the betrayed partner. I recently, a few years back actually, made a workshop by Dr. Susan Johnson on the effect of affairs on marriages. And she was showing quite expertly how PTSD is the result with many betrayed partners. And the same happens with pornography. People that use pornography often think that, well, it doesn't hurt anybody, doesn't affect anybody, it's private. You are so wrong if you think that. Children model how you cope. They learn with their eyes, not your words. They see your detachment. They may not know that you're using pornography, but they see your lack of dialogue. They see how you cope and don't cope. They see you preoccupied with your device rather than their mother or their father. It's generational, these coping mechanisms. They may have an eating disorder. They may self-soothe with food, but they have learned how to self-soothe by watching you. They So it's generational. They see how you may carry on without resolving things. Persons with pornography often get sexual problems in their life with arousal and such. And there's escalated arguments. And because of the impairment in the braking system, there is a potential for violence. That's why I mentioned Dahmer. Instead of dealing with the level of one's vulnerabilities, persons keep their concerns, their worries, and their fears inside. And the extent of this is pandemic. It creates insecure attachment and anxiety. And most people, we all experience some connection-based anxieties and some performance-based fears, but it's a way of resolving this rather than actually becoming healed and secure in oneself and in one's connection to God. The questions of, am I good enough? Am I lovable enough? Will you stay connected to me when I need you? These can be addressed emotionally, and they can be addressed in a marriage or a community. They can be addressed spiritually with God. He always stays connected with us, and we're never good enough. And that's why we as Christians rely on our Savior. He's sufficient. But this takes an application of our spirituality to these core connection issues that human beings have. What happens instead, modern day relationships seldom fulfill what's called in therapy a blue leg connecting. Well, I don't think I have time to explain it, but it's basically a balance between the assertiveness system and the connection system. That's the assertiveness is our sympathetic nervous system. The connection system that seeks connection is our parasympathetic nervous system. The blue leg is the parasympathetic, that part of us that wants attachment. The red leg, by contrast, and we need a balance of both, is the part of us ourselves that needs some gas in our engine, some assertiveness to get ourselves moving, to bring up issues, to have some leadership. These are a continuum. Either one can be too strong in a relationship. And a good relationship, here's a clue, for those that have to work through their relationships, need a balance between the blue leg and the red leg, the assertiveness and the connection systems. When people open up, they're often shut down by others because the crux of it is it tends to not be safe. It tends to not be cool to need other human beings. Needing others lets us down, sets us up to be let down, to be hurt, to be disappointed, to be abandoned, and to feeling worse when the need isn't met. So that's also another reason why we need to be rooted and based on Jesus. He does not let us down. He does not disappoint us. And a mature human being that is rooted and connected in the Lord can then turn to the Lord when human beings don't have the capacity to come through. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't, and that's life. So what happens, people turn, instead of the Lord, they look to their pets, they look to their Facebook friends where they just post, hoping to get a nice response, and unfortunately, tragically, they look to pornography, which never fails for the moment to make them feel good. So that's why we call it a detached, self-soothing coping mechanism. But then it tends to bite you in the rear. It leaves most people empty, craving more, and makes them hardened. They become preoccupied with images and desire for porn, much like alcohol. It doesn't allow you to be in tune. You become robotic, as I said, and there's a massive amount of shame that accompanies porn users. What we need to do instead is create a VC to VC connection. That's a vulnerable child. That's the blue leg that I was talking about, connected to the more vulnerable. Doesn't mean we're children. It's that part of our human nature that God has created that is seeking connection, that that softer side of ourselves that is looking for connection, connecting to the other person at the same level, rather than the more aggressive and assertive side. It's distinct from the other part of our nervous system, which I've explained, and those two polarities need balancing in a healthy adult. The connection leg needs to come first, with a little leading from the assertiveness leg. Well, I've explained to you some about the detached self-soother and the detached protector. The detached protector is the type of coping mode that just makes you numb from all of your thoughts and feelings. Just carrying on, stiff upper lip. It's very common in certain cultures. But now you discover that if you're the spouse of a person that's using porn, you are abandoned by the mistress of porn or the Mr. Porn. It actually is often worse, a worse competitor than an actual named human being that is in the other person's life. Why? Because now the spouse is confronted with an unnamed competitor, even a machine or a robot that ousts them out of the marital bed. And you'll often find that spouses of porn users are feeling like, why are we not making love more often? What's going on here? Why are you not interested in me? That spouse is left with these betrayal wounds. How come you don't come to me? Don't I arouse you anymore? And sadly, the truth is that the porn user often does not get aroused any longer by their spouse. They're needing higher and higher levels of stimulation that come from more extreme sexual antics. The betrayal wounds go deep in marriage. They last for years, and it usually takes marital therapy to heal it. Is it lust or eroticism? St. John Paul II explains eroticism as something good and beautiful, that interior force which draws man to what is good and true and beautiful. But by contrast, he says that pure lust is specifically that which is condemned in the Sermon of the Mount. And he explains that a man could commit adultery in his heart by lusting after his own wife, as Jesus says about committing adultery in the heart. He later explains that lust makes whoever it is directed towards a sexual object rather than a human being of innate dignity. Is it loving or using? Let's look at this from a social conscience and values-based perspective. Let's say you're talking to someone that doesn't have much of a religious formation. Just look at the ways that it uses others. Sexual urge draws us to the physical and psychological aspects of the person of a person of the opposite sex. It's meant to orient us towards the other person who possesses those attributes, not just the attributes themselves. And Dr. Suri makes a very clear case for the fact of how it actually instead uses the others. Some say that the use isn't harmful, but is using another as an object that depersonalizes and is for the sake of self-soothing ever an okay thing to do? And what about oneself? Is splitting off one's sexuality into a mere organic animal function and appetite? Is that useful to learn and practice? It's harmful to individuals from a Christian perspective, from also these, I've kind of repeated these here that you can see. I will let you look at this on your own time. It definitely leads to estrangement from God. God is pure. He can't connect with what is impure. That's why we need Jesus, both God and man, to bridge the gap. A person that's purporting to be a Christian may be outwardly practicing religious rituals or even celebrating the holy sacrifice of the Mass, but personally. And the Mass, of course, is valid regardless of the state of the person celebrating, even a porn user. But personally, that person cannot be connected because God cannot be connected with a person that's living in darkness like that. That's why we need the sacrament of confession. And the Lord never ceases to be merciful and bring us back to a clean slate. Pornography is against the 10 commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Porn is a god. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Porn goes against number 1, number 7, and number 10. It goes against the greatest commandment that Jesus gave us of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Not pornography. It's animal level sex from the perspective of nature and values-based responsibility. You can read more from Pope St. John Paul II and Dr. Sri. And note this, that even though pornography has addictive qualities, it does not, sorry, I have a typo here. Your free will is not suspended by it. It may be impaired, but it is not suspended, and your free will can be strengthened once again. Again, here we have some research from a science background of how it's harmful to marriages and matrimony, leading to decline in sexual satisfaction, destruction of loving relationships, separating the, sorry, I have a typo here, the goals of love and the potential for generation of life from love and mutual self-giving. And it encourages a throwaway culture of disposable relationships. It certainly denies the legitimacy of sexuality and family as defined by God. I've explained how it is connected to PTSD. It has a ripple effect. It's never an isolated act. It also harms the children, as I've explained. It harms those used in the creation of it. It is harmful to society as a whole. God sees what's done in secret, and his view is that Scripture emphatically states that defiling the mind and heart with lust is sinful and the moral and spiritual equivalent of adultery, and may lead to committing adultery or breaking your vows of celibacy and chastity. However, God reaches out with open arms of Jesus, his Son, offering forgiveness through the sacrament of penance. To whom? To yourself, to your relationship with God. And if married, God gives the capacity through grace to renew your spouse, whom you belong to, body, mind, and spirit. And we do need to do penance to rectify the damage done in all of these different spheres. Though forgiveness is for the asking, the healing is a journey. And I know of cases where people have stopped pornography. Stopping pornography is not simply the answer. It's an easy delusion to think that all is well. The porn viewer or user needs to learn many skills in order to be healed. They need to learn coping skills for opening up in true, honest, and transparent ways. They need to transform a view of themselves and others from sexual machines or objects or toys to be played with. They need to be washed clean in holiness. They need to learn to avoid conflict and the failed bids for connection from people in their lives, but to reconnect, to learn how to reconnect in a constant tango, a dance that is perceiving the bids for connection from others in their lives, spouse or religious community or parish community, and responding to them rather than closing off and avoiding. They need to learn how to deal with their uncomfortable emotions, their anger, irritation, and impatience, to use those emotions in the way that God intended, so that they give gas in our engine, make us aware, and help us open up. We need also often healing all the way back to childhood, what actually started the use of pornography. So a dry porn addict is like a dry drunk. Just stopping the porn doesn't make it all better. And also, the family needs to understand how to support that person. They often play into the compulsions their mates have. The same with OCD disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. The spouse needs to be aware of the cycles of non-connecting, the cycles of avoidance, and the cycles of focusing on productivity in the relationship, or even the religious community or the diocesan community, versus the connection between the persons and the connection with Jesus. Where is the spouse's focus? Where are your brothers and sisters? Where are they focusing? Are they focusing on what you're accomplishing, or are we focusing on relationships? As you noticed, Jesus focused on relationships. Look as you read the Gospels, meditate on that. Matrimony is a sacrament of union, and we are all the victims. There's a ripple effect. And the use among celibate clergy and religious and consecrated celibates, it affects them the same as in matrimony. The resolutions are connecting with other Christians and Catholic Christians in prayer, meaningful participation in the Eucharist, in penance, psychotherapy for true growth, interpersonal connection in brotherhood or sisterhood with at least one trusted confidant that's part of your spiritual family. God always gives us at least one person. The family that spontaneously prays together stays together a lot easier. I really encourage the family not only to go to Mass together, to pray the rosary, especially with meditation on the gospel mysteries. That's very important, that meditation happen in saying the rosary, that we imitate the Lord and his life, but that we also pray spontaneously with each other. That's not so easy for many Catholics to do, but it's harder to hide our emotions, hide our issues when we have to pray spontaneously together. If families pray together and they're very shallow in their spontaneous prayers and they don't have much to say, one needs to reflect on, why is one's head so empty? Why is that space still taken up by porn? What's going on here? Here are some scriptures that I encourage you to look at. As with all plagues, a Christian needs to protect themselves and their family against pornography. This slide has some ways to do that. You can read that after. The Lord encourages us to be children of the light and forget about satisfying our bodies with all their cravings. Romans chapter 13. And lastly, we come to our references. And the final slide is some helpful websites that can help you have internet protection for pornography, actually track a pornography user's visit to various porn sites, and give a spouse or a community member a report on what they're doing. So I apologize for whipping through that so much, but I hope that you will enjoy the slides later. And I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chiara. You had provided me with a poll question. Do you want me to
yes,
to share that out?
I would love that. You guys are right on. You listened.
Nicely done.
The real enemy is the detached self-soother coping mode. if we can help people handle life and their emotions where they don't need to detach and be open and transparent.
Very good. So that's a good prelude to our questions. If you open the chat room, there are 4 questions there, and I'll read the questions. Question 1 is things you can do to help someone who uses porn. 2, have you ever tried one of these, and what was the short-term result in terms of opening up the person and allying with them? And then there's a handful of options. 3, how could the concept of having a common enemy start to unite an alienated couple? How might you bring that concept up and express it? And 4, if applicable, what have you done to be a safe person for your family or others struggling with pornography? Which of the following were you able to do? So now we'll be able to have our discussion. Dr. Chiara, if you'd like to moderate.
Sure, thank you. On the first question of basically how you can help someone that uses porn and what you've tried, it seemed like there in our group, there was a kind of consensus that everyone made an effort at trying to find out what their deeper needs and fears and anxieties were. I know that one of our participants had some sharing on the use of scriptures, specifically from the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, that much of the content was connected to some sexual references, and that was very enlightening for us. I'm wondering if you all would like to share anything that you learned from each other in your groups on this question 1. Anyone have any comments?
On things you can do to help someone who uses porn, I can throw out one. There are services like Covenant Eyes that provide partner sharing, with your internet connection. So if you go to any sites that Covenant Eyes flags, those sites are sent in a report to your partner. What do you think about services like that that hold people to a greater accountability, Dr. Chiara?
I think that's excellent. I've suggested that to many of my clients. One would have to have a close brother, or if one is a religious, let's kind of think of how that would apply. You would have to have someone that, like an accountability partner, that's what it's called in Covenant Eyes. You'd have to pick an accountability partner in your spiritual community. And obviously there has to be someone that that the porn user can count on keeping confidentiality. It has to be safe. And I think that's a very good resource. It's one I often use. I think one of the most important things, though, is to encourage them to get therapy. I can't overemphasize that enough, because just stopping alone is not going to change they won't develop a healthy coping mechanism just by stopping the porn. They still don't know how to deal with what the stuff is that they can't deal with in life.
So you're saying that they may pick up an addiction or a compulsion that's even worse.
Yeah.
To replace.
Or they just they can just stay even detached, and carry on, and then they can become vulnerable to becoming angry and reacting fast to people, not controlling that. They can become vulnerable to being seduced by a parishioner. I mean, there's all sorts of vulnerabilities people can have when their core needs for connection aren't getting met. The problem is they have a connection issue with themselves, their emotions, and other people.
My only concern there is I don't trust the internet for anything confidential. And usually for a starter, I would say, turn on your parental blocks and put the word Jesus in. And so that might slow you down, but I don't know how effective that would be. But
I do agree with the parental blocks. I have not heard about the way the report comes, Father Uke, it comes to in email fashion. And I think it's possible that you can sign up for Covenant Eyes with any kind of pseudonym. So, there's the IP address, but I doubt that anyone's going to track that.
I don't know. These days, it's very easy to do with all these logarithms and stuff.
Yeah, I know. So that part I don't know how to answer.
And I think that's actually how they were identified, rather by your IP address rather than your name.
Well, it wouldn't stop somebody who is truly compulsive from finding a different way to get a way to get around the filter instead of using.
Yes.
That's true. That's true. Also.
I know it's a weak thing, but it's
Yeah.
But it's something, yeah.
It's something.
And to have somebody else set up your parental blocks if you're the one struggling would be also useful because if you set them up, then you know the password to unset them. Whereas somebody else who sets them up can put in a password that says, you can't get back into this unless you know the code. Which is something that we did with our television when we got cable. Make certain that all of the shows are, the stations that show those kinds of things are blocked. And none of the kids have access to the parental block code.
Right.
So,
on another note, Dr. Sebastian, what I want to respond to is on this point of encouraging them to get therapy. The real issue is that the sharing doesn't go deep enough in families and in communities, and that's part of what we need to change. That it needs to be personal and deep, and even self-disclosing in some vulnerable ways that we can admit that this is everyone gets this unwanted thought, or everyone struggles with anxiety over this or that. That's natural to being human. But how we cope with it, we need to be able to normalize that and encourage each other that there are healthy ways to cope with these things rather than having a sense of shame. I can't manage that, or I have these thoughts that bother me, and then people deaden them out. Well, one of the examples I want to give is that one time there was someone I was working with that had porn addiction all the way back to about 10 or 13 years of age. And the gentleman got over it very quickly when we actually worked with a wound that he had connected to his mother, that he had a ton of unresolved anger towards his mother. And there was bad sexual modeling between the parents. When we got to the wound with his mother and we did what's called rescripting it, allowing Jesus to enter into some memory images and talking to the young boy in the image, the healing was just amazing. He lost all desire for pornography in a matter of a couple sessions, and there was no relapsing. And so, sometimes there are these core wounds, where people can't handle something really shuts them down. I had a woman tell me the other day, I'm glad you're seeing my daughter. Could you help me too? Which I can't because of the multiple relationships. But, when I was in third grade, something happened with my mother, and I decided from now on I was never going to open up myself to anyone else. You have these wounds, and they affect the trajectory of a person's whole life.
And this is chemotherapy you're talking about.
Chemotherapy, but other therapies use some of these tools as well. I do what's called Jesus-centered chemotherapy. I invite Jesus right into that session with the client, and the client experiences imaging Jesus. They narrate to me what Jesus is actually telling them in this image, and they get some of their unmet need met in a spiritual connection with the Lord in that image. And it makes a huge difference, even though it's imagery. The Lord is present he's eternal. So the past, the future, and the present are eternally present to him. So there's nothing to stop him from walking right back into a person's past and healing that memory.
Other thoughts on these other questions?
Yeah. We didn't get to any more questions, just the first one in our group, Dr. Sebastian. Did the others get to the second question? And did you have any thoughts on that one? On the one about how you would work with a common enemy to help a couple connect together? Any thoughts on that?
Sometimes I think it's Satan.
Well, Satan is always the common enemy. Yes.
Well, he's in the background, but has to manipulate things.
Right.
I had originally had that, Father Uke, on the poll, an option for Satan. And Dr. Chiara said, you might remove that from the poll because, everybody will select that one.
I'll give you one little idea of how you can make this a common enemy. See, it helps the traumatized spouse get over it some by recognizing that the problem isn't, that this person is just a bad husband or whatever, or a bad, priest or whatever. The problem is that they don't know how to cope. And it's the coping enemy that's the coping mode, the detached self-soother, that's the enemy of the porn user and the enemy of the victim family, spiritual family or matrimonial family. It's the coping mode that's that enemy. And so if you actually even say, okay, let's put that coping mode in this chair over here, and let's all three of us, if you're a clergy person or you're a therapist, you say, let's all get angry at that coping mode. Like, you've wrecked my life. You've wrecked my wife's life. I'm not going to let you in our home anymore. We're going to kick you out. You've harmed our children. And then, the spouse gets angry at it. You've destroyed me. You've ousted me from the marital bed. I hate you. See, they're projecting their anger against the coping mode. Now, that's marvelous. The anger is no longer against the person that's sitting there in shame. The anger is against the mode that we're trying to destroy and block out, and then replace it with, and I'm going to help you, and in your helplessness, find a more healthy coping mode. We're going to explore that together of how we can do that. We're going to improve our family and our family dialogue, or our religious family. We're going to improve these connections so that you enemy in that chair, don't go intruding and bringing your evil into our family anymore. You see how you can work that? So it takes it off of the person being shamed and put down and preached at, and it's that coping mode.
Well, let's thank you for that, Dr. Chiara. Let's move to some of the questions in the last 10 minutes we have.
Yeah, let's do that.
Paula has asked a few questions, so we can begin with one of hers.
Okay.
She says, you mentioned there are anatomical changes that happen with regular pornography use. If that is the case, what hope is there that pornography addiction can be cured?
That is a good question. I don't know if there's studies about anatomical changes changing. Well, yes, there are actually. I don't know about specifically if they've gotten that far to study it with pornography use, but we have seen the neuroplasticity, it's called, of the brain. And we've seen that the brain can rewire itself. And so that means that people that have trouble with their braking system can, with repeated use of a new coping mechanism, develop actually new neural pathways that are frequently traveled. And it's like, if you lived in Buffalo and you have all the snow and you got to tunnel out a pathway, as my husband told me when he grew up, it's kind of like tunneling a new pathway in your brain. And with repeated use, it gets used. So yes, the brain can retunnel new pathways.
So is there any hope for a cure, would be the question. Can those pathways be, so you're saying the new pathways can close off the old pathways that lead to the,
or at least they can reroute it. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it closes off. I don't know exactly how it works, but I don't know if we know that, but it reroutes it. It's just like when someone has trauma, physical trauma of like an impact to the brain, and then they get paralyzed in a certain way, and then they practice something that allows them actually to reprogram it. And we've seen this. We've seen this actually even with people that have cerebral palsy. I recently came across a case where a couple had adopted an infant that had cerebral palsy. They discovered it at infancy, and they worked extremely hard with people that were expert in reprogramming those brain pathways. And now that person is an athlete, speaks clearly, and you would never know they had cerebral palsy.
It's funny, it reminds me that I got addicted to playing Free Cell. And so I finally took it off my computers, and for about 6 months, I was looking for the mouse to play it. And now that's all gone. But the thing is, I mean, that was breaking a pathway.
Yeah, that was breaking a pathway, Father Uke. Exactly. Good question. Thank you for that.
Paula had a follow-up question to that then, and you may have answered it just now. Can an older person actually be cured? Or,
yes.
Or maybe even a person who's a long-time user?
Yes. Yes. It's the short answer. I mean, with the therapy, I mean, I've had people that have had pornography that are elderly and couples. And besides the pornography, they had a number of other, sexual compulsions that were pretty extreme. And, the wife was really turned off and put off and hurt by it all. And, they're completely abstinent on all of the immoral stuff. And they have actually a nice, healthy relationship, sexual relationship. And they're over 60.
One of the things that we kind of grew up with, at least as older people, is when we were raised, we were always taught that sexual sins of thought, that when you had thoughts of sex, it was sinful and you were committing a sin. And I try to differentiate, at least in the confessional, but then I give up on some of the old people because I don't think it really changed them there. But it's like I said, you got to look that there's a temptation of thought and there's a sin of thought. And you got to learn to pick, to draw a line, to recognize, one is a temptation while the other is a sin. So if you're entertaining the thought, it would be a sin. But you could even do that like for murder and stuff like that. I'm sure there are a lot of people we'd like to murder, but that's a temptation. We don't do it. And we don't think about how to do it. But I think that has messed up a lot of people in the Catholic community.
Yeah, in dealing with people like young people, even females that have obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, they often will get sexual thoughts that they become scrupulous about, that they think is sinful. And, part of what we have to do is learn to teach them to be able to just tolerate that state and let it just kind of pass through them. That's where we use some mindfulness techniques where they can realize that they're not being contaminated. The problem is it's unwanted thought. It's not deliberate. And the more they get freaked out about it, the more it actually makes it worse.
Yes.
So we teach them, how to tolerate that and get through that.
Maybe just one more question before our seminarian Mike Elsner closes us in prayer.
Sure.
The person wrote, you mentioned the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. I am familiar with those two systems as flight or fight. How does this correlate with your view of those two systems?
They're exactly correlated. So it's fight, flight, or, we also can call it top dog, underdog, and no dog. Top dog is the fighting. Underdog is the one that surrenders. And And no dog is the person that's out of there. So when the parasympathetic is activated, it is your underdog, the one that's coming for connection and wanting the attachment. When the sympathetic is activated, it's the top dog, the fighting. And the no dog can be a combination of either. Out of there, being out of there, you can actually be in an internal activated angry state, which is actually the sympathetic, but still cope by being detached and out of there. Or you can have an internal fearful, anxious state and be out of there. So in contextual chemotherapy, they go into a lot of detail on this. There's a book by my colleague, Dr. Edgar Rodinger, on the subject, but they explain that there is a balance you want to have a balance of both systems. So you have enough assertiveness and gas in your engine, enough fight, but not like red hot fight, pink, a little leading, and then enough of your attachment side where you're reaching out, showing your wanting, your caring and your concern so that you maintain the social connection. I hope that answers it for you.
All right. So any final thoughts, Dr. Chiara, before we ask Mike to lead us in a closing prayer?
Do I have final thoughts? Let's see. Thank you. I really enjoyed presenting to you. Thank you for your participation in being here. It's really encouraging to see that you have concerns about persons that you care about in your life and in your ministry. And I pray that the Lord just give you the courage and the strength to be vocal and reach out to folks that are struggling and have courage in doing that.
On behalf of the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, Dr. Chiara, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. And I look forward to continuing to work with you on these various points as ITEST moves forward. Our seminarian, Mike Elsner, is a third-year seminarian for the Diocese of San Angelo, currently studying at Kenrick Glennon Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. Mike, would you please lead us in a closing prayer?
Thank you, Doctor. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Eternal Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together to learn about and discuss the psychology of pornography, a trap that in many ways has caused numerous wounds in our world. Help us to use this knowledge to instruct the faithful, our families, and our friends, so that we may all acknowledge the dignity of every human person as your children, and to live lives of virtue and purity. This time we ask for the intercession of Saint Maria Goretti, patron of chastity. O Saint Maria Goretti, who, strengthened by God's grace, did not hesitate even at the age of 12 to shed your blood and sacrifice life itself to defend your virginal purity. Look graciously on an unhappy human race which has strayed far from the path of eternal salvation. Teach us all, especially the youth, with what courage and promptitude we should flee for the love of Jesus, anything that could offend him or stain our souls with sin. Obtain for us from the Lord the victory in temptation, comfort in the sorrows of life, and the grace with which we earnestly beg of thee to help us to rid us from the scourge of pornography, and may one day enjoy with thee the imperishable glory of heaven. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everybody. Please consider coming to our next webinar, which will be held on November 20th, presented by Monsignor Gene Morris and Dr. Stacy Trasankos on the theology and science of the Eucharist. That's the end of today's webinar. God bless everybody, and have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.